So if we think about this, there's a nice sort of laboratory here thinking about the water resilience portfolio. So the recent sort of initiatives and the major call for partnerships in California. And as we think about this idea of partnerships, a lot of the investment, and this is from Ellen Hannock and a report from PPIC, a lot of the debt in the investment, as shown here, is going to be bared, locally. So this is the local agencies or the local suppliers in terms of this, in terms of the majority of costs that are going to go into these partnerships and the way that they're actually funded and the underlying financial risk. So if we think about this and the challenges for partnership design, we can think about the hydrologic, engineered, and institutional complexity of these systems. Think about the interactions and externalities across the supply networks that connect them, uncertainty in future climate demand and governance, and the heterogeneities, risks, and trade-offs that are going to emerge, actually across multiple scales, but in particular when you start to resolve local scale. So key points for the talk today: just resilient partnerships in major water infrastructure investments requires a careful understanding of the institutionally complex dynamics in which they function in the West. Partnership design decisions in combination with hydroclimatic uncertainties can create challenging financial and water supply benefit trade-offs. And I'll highlight that in more detail later in the talk. And then capturing partner-level heterogeneity is critical for understanding the stability and success of these potential partnerships or coalitions or cooperation in investment. So as the example that I'll use today, just to go through, we're going to focus in on the Friant-Kern Canal and actually groundwater banking. And so as we think about the system, and particularly the Friant-Kern Canal, so it's fairly famous. So these are famous images of subsidence and aquifer or potential overpumping, where you get this extreme subsidence, and then the canal slows by 60% due to the subsidence. And the federal and local officials have actually created a partnership and investment to repair the canal. And in addition to that, thinking about the canal or the conveyance, in addition to that is the potential for groundwater banking. And that groundwater banking and the canal sort of connecting that flood drought dynamics and the whiplash of the system. So in the example that we're going to talk about, the actual baseline is a $50 million canal expansion investment by a collection of water providers known as the Friant contractors. We're going to stick with the $50 million cost that was local. It's a lower bound. It neglects $450 million from additional funds that were from federal, state, and regional organizations. And in the example we're going to talk about today, there's also a new groundwater banking facility, also costed out at about $50 million in the results that I'll show you. And it was actually based on the design of the Kern Water Bank at the Friant-Kern Canal and the Tule River. Both projects are assumed to be financed using 30-year revenue bonds with a 3% interest, consistent with bonds in the water districts in California. And assuming equal annual payments over time translates to a debt payment of about $2.55 million per year for either the canal or the groundwater, or if we think about using both together, about $5.1 million per year for both projects. So if we do an exploratory modeling and think about this, so we're using that Friant-Kern Canal partnership, actual partnership, but we're going to explore around it. It's not necessarily meant to be any kind of form of critique of that, but just to look at the different types of partnerships that could emerge for this system and what their different properties are. And so what we're going to explore is who participates in these partnerships, and there's up to 40 different districts that could participate. Who pays how much, so what are their shares, and what do we build? So the question is, it could be just the canal refurbishment, could be the groundwater bank, or could be both. And then we're going to put these different partnerships into different potential hydrologic conditions. And so what we're going to do initially is just look at 3 50-year synthetic hydrologies. So as you see here, the synthetic hydrologies. So in black is actually the historical. Blue, we're going to look at a wet scenario. Red is a synthetic dry scenario. And then in the background gray, that's actually some hidden Markov modeling where we had actually created multiple realizations of the system. And then we're going to take those ensembles, those partnerships, and combine them with the different scenarios. And then we're going to simulate those through the California Food, Energy, Water CalFuse system. And we're going to look at the partnership level outcomes and partner level outcomes. And just to go into a little bit of background on the CalFuse simulation model, this is something that my team in collaboration with UNC and then led by HB Zeff, Andrew Hamilton, who was the lead author of the papers I'm sharing, and one of my former postdocs here, Kayvon Malik, and a broader team as part of a NSF Infuse project. This was a large-scale effort to create a unique representation of the system where you can look at the hydrologic input, the historical input series, regulatory parameters, and infrastructure parameters going into this system. And as we come through, we have the observed state variable, snowpack flow, district demands. As we come through, snowmelt forecasts, monthly flow forecast, expected annual water demand, and different model states in terms of salinity, reservoir storage, contract deliveries, recharge capacity. And all of this is within the complex regulatory content, rules of the system in terms of minimum flows, delta flows, etc., and using state-aware sort of agent representation rules of reservoir operators, water contract managers, irrigation districts, and then thinking about the broader capacity and priority in terms of the water rights of the system. So if we think about this, this is sort of the representation of CalFuse. And so we're coming from the north, the Sacramento-San Joaquin River basins, down the water conveyance into the Tulare. And it's capturing the major transfers, so the State Water Project through Oroville into San Luis, and also the Central Valley Project and Shasta down into the deliveries districts and groundwater banks. It's a modular structure. It took us about 5 years, actually, of collective investment to create this simulation framework that we're going to test the partnerships on, capturing, hydroclimate, the delta, districts, reservoirs, canals, groundwater bank, and contracts. So overall, it's open source. It has some unique traits. It's a daily timescale. Comprehensive representation. So if you look at all the different institutional rules, infrastructure elements, all those things that shape the way that water is conveyed, stored in the system, there's more than 1,000 institutional and infrastructure elements and detailed rights representations, and it was designed to be computationally scalable, as you'll see, for high performance computing and large scenario ensemble analysis. And this is the GitHub where we have the Python, Cython versions of the model. It's unique in the sense that it allows us, this is a day in September 2006, where this is that Sankey diagram of the flows coming from the Sacramento into the Tulare Basin, the surface water contract allocations, contractor groups, and water use types. So we're tracking the supplies, demands, and deliveries across a complex network of users. And just a little bit in terms of the testing. So again, here what you have is observed versus simulated in terms of historical context. So there was a lot of effort in terms of capturing the actual dynamics in the major storages, taking those major storage dynamics and then actually capturing those down into the fairly complex interbasin transfers from the State Water Project, Central Valley Project pumping, and then the delta salinity. And then that further then flows down to the groundwater banking in, for example, Kern Water Bank accounts or semi-tropic. So what this does is this allows us to have a multi-scale model. We're at daily scale in terms of our simulation to inform our exploratory modeling for the detailed dynamics that shape the alternative free canal partnership structures. So just to come back, so we're exploring the different cases of globally sampled different types of partnerships in terms of who, what share, and project types. We're testing them under these scenarios. We're running through that daily timescale of CalFuse, and then we're going to be looking at captured water gains, cost of the gains, and overall starting to explore the viability of the project. So just to start in terms of the distribution of the type of outcomes that you get for this type of sampling and the differences across the different types of partnerships, what we're looking at here are captured water gains, so the expected new water delivered by the investment. And in terms of the diagram, we have the histogram, the median, you have your interquartile ranges highlighted. So there's a huge distribution of the benefits across alternative partnerships, projects, and hydroclimatic scenarios. So it's potentially the partnership, because we're only really talking about two infrastructure options, either individually or collectively. But when you vary the partnerships, you get a huge change in terms of captured water gain. And just for the sake of orienting people in terms of it, gigaliter is equivalent to 800 acre feet, so enough to irrigate about 200 to 500 acres of crops in the region. And actually an alternate metric we can think about is the cost of gains. So you can think about that distributed annual debt service payment divided by the captured water. And so what you see here is that you have a wider actual distribution. So beyond just the volumetric benefit of the project, you get a fairly substantial shift and extremes in terms of the marginal cost or the annual debt payment service in terms of the partnerships. And if we look at this even further and divide this out across the 40 districts that could be considered as part of this partnership, the water districts have very different abilities to actually capitalize on this. And so what you're looking at here is captured water gains, and then the different districts. And the districts are mapped depending on their tier and location. And the costs of this, or the cost of gains, are even more heterogeneous than the actual captured water gains. So you have a system, it's fairly simple in terms of it's only two sort of infrastructure options. And we're just looking at 3 different hydrology scenarios, and you get a huge actual variation in terms of what the system delivers and its financial risk. So the geographical and institutional contexts are critical to consider. So, and this is part of one of the unique features of the analysis, is that typically this would be looked at in a very aggregate form, and you would not have the dynamics resolved all the way down to the district level. So what does this mean for the viability of partnerships overall? So we can think about this as in terms of thresholds. So if we have the average cost for partnership, right, in terms of dollars per megaliter, and then the cost for the worst off partner within a coalition or a partnership that's cooperating. If we think about this, what we're showing here are the dry, average, and wet scenarios. Square is canal, circle is bank, and then the triangle is both. So we've sampled globally across the partnership structures, and you get a broad variety here of different outcomes. So if we look at it, typically right now, water providers in this region typically charge about $30 to $150 per megaliter. And so if we cap at about $200 per megaliter in terms of average cost, and then if we think about this, that eliminates, so 70% of the partnerships are still viable. But then if we account for the worst off cases, and cut back in terms of the worst off and extreme cases in terms of the financial side, then it's a substantial reduction in what are feasible partnerships. So to ensure the viability for individual partners in addition to the average partnership itself, and you can think about an average or aggregate cost benefit analysis. So they're very different in terms of the individual cases and then the individual risk profiles. So 8% of the partnerships are viable across all of the scenario cases. If we further constrain that and think about the dry scenario itself, less than 1% of them are actually viable. So you have this large suite of possibilities, but actually to get a viable cost balanced partnership is actually quite non-trivial, and especially if you start to think about the potential differences in terms of the hydroclimatology and the differences in exposure and extremes. So what I just showed you was actually a little bit different than the paper I shared, but it was the preliminary work with myself, Greg, HB, and Andrew. And so it's what we extended on for some of the more sophisticated analytics that I'll share in a second, but this was published in Earth's Future. So after we had finished this, the question that came up is it possible actually to discover, because we just did a random exploration of different partnerships and then contextualize that relative to the baseline partnership of the free contractors, is to actually robust partnership structures better understand their trade-offs and then clarify how uncertainty could shape their stability. So that brings us to the paper that was shared with the talk, I believe. And so what we're thinking about here is understanding supply and financial risk trade-offs more explicitly. So again, similar but much, much larger computational experiment when we look at this. And so when we're exploring this, one of the things my group is known for is actually this multi-objective simulation optimization, and we're able to do fairly sophisticated stochastic optimization. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of details, but we were able to explore a very large space of where you have 40 different districts that combine in a variety of ways in terms of who's in and who's out, what shares, and what combination of the projects. And looking at 600,000 different evaluations of that in terms of the explored space. And so what that did is the algorithm allowed us then to connect the simulation optimization to CalFuse. And just in terms of the stochastic formulation, during the formulation, we searched, each evaluation was based on daily simulations over 900 scenario years. And then after we actually did the optimization, we reevaluated every solution with an out-of-sample reevaluation of stochastic HMM-based samples for 1900 scenario years at the daily scale. So, and we're terming this reevaluation actually as a fairly well characterized. So what we did is we actually developed the hidden Markov modeling and the replicate scenario years off most recent history. So this isn't necessarily projecting out into the decades in terms of thinking about non-stationarity or climate change. It's just accounting for the fairly extreme internal variability of the California system itself. And then we take this and then continue to do our analysis, thinking about captured water gains, cost of gains, and again, thinking a little more carefully about the project viability. So in terms of thinking about the trade-offs, just to go through this, so each of the objectives that we considered, so one of the things is that there's some inherent coalition building and partnership. So one of the things is maximizing that size of the partnership within the limits of the 40 candidate partners that could be included. And so up is good for that. A second objective is the captured water gain for that partnership, which we've already discussed. Another potential objective is the degree that we could actually reduce pumping of groundwater in the system. And so this is an area where you have sigma and a lot of regulatory effort to improve the sustainability of the groundwater system. And then captured water gain for non-partners. So this is actually pretty important from an institutional perspective. So if you go negative on this axis, which is not the preferred direction, you are potentially creating a situation where right holders may consider that their right has been injured, and that can lead to legal challenges and a variety of additional potential expenses. If you look at some of the work by Philip Wombley, in terms of the transaction costs on transfers in the Colorado, the actual cost of the legal elements and the modeling can actually be as expensive as 100% of the project cost itself. And then the 90th percentile cost for the worst off partner. We have sort of the overall partnership and then sort of that worst off partner. So what we have here, again, the ideal would just be a line at the top. And the fact that in this parallel axes plot, this represents one partnership. This is actually the baseline partnership, the actual partnership. And so this isn't necessarily from the algorithm. And what you see is when you have these potentials, the slope right here represents the trade-off between these different potential objectives. And if we actually go back, the prior study, which was just random, it wasn't a systematic search, these are the high performing partnerships that we discovered. So one of the things that you can see is actually that the Freant-Kern partnership, the actual partnership, is actually fairly high performing relative to the random samples that we've sampled in the exploratory analysis. Now in color, we're superimposing what we discovered from our broader exploration with the multi-objective search. And so we have these solutions where they can only be improved in one objective by degrading performance in another. So this is the sort of Pareto approximate set or Pareto frontier across these performance objectives. And one of the things that's interesting here is that you can see that there's a strong trade-off. So as you build that coalition, there's a tendency to have substantial potential worst off players within the coalition. There's a trade-off between the benefits for partners and non-partners, and this is pretty critical in terms of obviously you want the partnership to gain in terms of the investments and the capital investment actually providing the water, and also you need to be careful in terms of impacting other rights and in general trying to think about the non-partners in the system not being impacted. If we zoom in again, we can sort of look through and just to take a deeper dive into a couple of these solutions. So this is the status quo partnership from, and again, this is from the real world. This is not from optimization. This is the actual partnership as designed. And again, this is not meant to be as a critique as much as just an exploration of the space. And again, just to contextualize, we're only looking at either the canal, the groundwater bank, or both. That's actually fairly simple. Now, what's not so simple is how do you actually partner, given that you have 40 different candidate participants in that partnership and the dynamics of the system. So, if we think about this, the darker colors are partners that have higher share in the partnership. So that was some of the decisions. And the compromise from the optimization, as well as a majority of the multi-objective solutions, actually builds the canal expansion and does groundwater banking. And that actually makes sense if you think about the seasonal dynamics between flood drought and atmospheric rivers and the potential benefits of having improved surface conveyance and the ability to bank. So, and the compromise partnership dominates the status quo, the actual Freant-Kern in all objectives. And again, it's not meant as a critique, it's just exploring the candidate space. And it's interesting to distinguish the two. So one question we can ask is the compromise partnership actually still preferred over the status quo when we really look at the details of that reevaluated level of hydroclimatic uncertainty? Again, there's a tremendous amount of internal variability in this system. We're not actually projecting out into climate change. This is just doing a better job. So in any given hydrologic record, you don't have a tremendous amount of representations of your most extreme droughts or floods for that matter. And as Manu is a leader in the area, you can think about this as creating these realizations to get a better sense of those extremes and that variability. So if we look at this and we go back to our two solutions and compare them, so the objective values are, and as we mapped here, these are aggregated over 1900 scenario years. So this is, you can think of this as the expectation, right, in terms of what the trade-offs are across that. We can unfold that story a bit. So the distributions at any given point, so the point of intersection is the point of performance, right, that aggregate, and then this is the distribution around that point. And you can say for the different objectives, Performance varies widely. It's less certain or more certain depending on some of the different objectives. And if we superimpose and we look at that compromise solution, the compromise solution still is superior overall. There is overlap in terms of the sampled scenario years, and this is part of that looking in the robust optimization space. But what's interesting, when you start thinking about that overlap, and then some of the other concerns would be these rare cases where you have potentially strong negative impacts for non-partners, which again could be institutionally quite challenging. And then the other element is when looking at these systems, cost-benefit analyses, traditional analyses, a lot of times we're looking in the aggregate, not necessarily in the distribution, and the differences in the distribution depending on the differences in the way that we actually evaluate the systems for different performance. So if we think about this, we can think about the impact of partner level heterogeneity, and do all the partners prefer the same partnership? So if we look at this, this is our cost of gains. Again, this is that debt per volume that we discussed earlier. And so when we're looking at this, and again, this is the distribution of the partnerships, and this is the status quo, the actual partnership, right? Most partners have a low cost under most scenarios, so that's fairly stable. But a few experience very high cost in some or all scenarios. So there are differences between their location, their context, their rights, their agreements, all that shape the dynamics and the risks and their ability to actually gain the water out of the share of investment. And if we start to look at the two relative to each other, you can see that the compromised partners experience significantly less cost-related risk. So it's bringing down sort of that tail exposure. And if you compare outcomes for partners appearing in both partnerships, we can sort of dive into what are the relative differences in the way that the two manifest in terms of the financial risk. So one of the things that we can look at is just looking at the difference in the cost of gains. And so in this case, just to define this, positive is actually negative. So that's an increased cost of your debt load. So that's an increased annual debt load relative to the volume of water that you gain. So some partners are going to significantly prefer the compromise solution, while others are actually going to significantly prefer the status quo. So one of the things about this is that the distributions at the partner level, not when heavily aggregated, can be very, very different. And that creates some complexity in terms of the way that you design the partnerships and the overall stability of the partnerships. So, and in a lot of cases, the shared partners are the districts that are included are largely neutral. So as I said, the heterogeneity here can threaten the stability of the partnership negotiations. So a few things here, just in terms of like some key takeaways on what we've shown. The robust water infrastructure investment partnerships are challenging to design and should be more central to planning process. Most of our analyses are extremely aggregated. They don't account for the dynamics, and they don't even distribute out to be able to get at that lower tier partner level differences. One of the things that made this possible, and some of the results I showed you, is that scalable exploratory simulation that captures those dynamics and institutional complexity, and then thinking about the robustness of partnerships across the conflicting objectives and the actual uncertainty. And again, I would say in the paper we write this as a fairly optimistic, actually, representation of the uncertainty. It's just accounting for the stationary our internal variability. And then thinking about how do we understand and discover stable many-party coalitions in these types of dynamics, particularly when the system and the uncertainties and the financial risks are getting more complex. So, and then third, addressing the challenges and require, obviously it goes well beyond engineering and thinking in partnerships across disciplines and thinking about economics, planning, etc., and actually many others. So I want to step back here a little bit And just so what we were talking about were districts in a very specific case for the Free and Kern Canal. And there's some really interesting work. And just to highlight this, Alvar Escrivá, who is now at University of California, Davis, and colleagues, looking at this idea of water partnerships, and you can think of it actually, it doesn't necessarily have to be ag, right? And thinking about cities and farms in Southern California and San Joaquin Valley. There's some nice take-home points from this report, and I think relevant to the overall presentation and focus that I've had in the prior examples. So factors that are affecting partnerships: the value of water varies across years and uses, so that's a challenge. Agencies' needs are varying over time. Financial capacity is also variable. Benefits go beyond water agencies' interests. Shared water rights or service areas can ease agreements, and it can also mean that you get some complexity in the dynamics and differences in the outcomes. Location can be an asset depending on how you can think about how you can amplify each other, and then infrastructure connections are important. And just some of the things just to highlight here in the different types of partnerships that can be contemplated. I think there are nice examples in the report in terms of thinking about, for example, co-investments, and then an example, farmers invest in alternative water supplies or water conservation. And Southern California, benefit increased water availability, financial help with local investments. Benefit to San Joaquin, increased water availability, challenges and limitations, cost of alternative supplies and water conservation. Expensive for farmers, and urban agencies reserve low-hanging fruit for themselves. So if you look at this table and the different types of strategies and partnerships, the relative challenges and limitations and the underlying element, I think another part of this is it really is important to capture the institutional complexity, the hydrology and the infrastructure and the connectivity. And then in many senses, you're going to have to capture the system evolving fairly substantially, both in terms of form and function. I think another interesting element is to just step out a little bit broader, and I don't think it's just Western water, but I do think water in the West is a major context. But if just looking at the most recent American Water Works Association State of the Water Industry report, there's some interesting things here. So there's a lot of information in the table. So let's just focus on actually this column for now. So what we're thinking about, top 10 issues facing water sector is ranked by all respondents, 2019 through 2024. So if you look at that top 10 issues, so watershed source water protection is the top issue in the particular 2024, financing for capital improvements, renewal and replacement of aging water and wastewater infrastructure, long-term water supply availability, and then first in 2024, the first survey to have this is the financial sustainability of the agencies themselves, thinking about the public understanding of the value of water systems, workforce issues, groundwater management, drought and periodic water table shortages, and cybersecurity. So, and if you think about this, actually this column is showing the relative change relative to the 2023 survey, but there is consistency here. So you're seeing the financing, the financial elements consistently through, and then increasingly emphasized, as well as the complexity of thinking about the long-term water supply availability. And I think all of that has a lot of concern for the way that we think about that we're going to have cooperative investment to improve both the reliability and the financial stability of the systems that we're trying to improve. So with that, actually, I have some of the paper titles here. I want to acknowledge that a lot of this work was actually funded by the National Science Foundation as part of a Track 2 Infuse. And again, the collaborators that were part of this, and some of the supercomputing was provided by the National Science Foundation's Access System and the Texas Advanced Computing Center. And yeah, just the tip of the hat to my UNC collaborators as well as Andrew Hamilton and Rohini Gupta. So with that, I'm happy to open the floor and take questions.
Thanks very much, Patrick. That was outstanding. As you know, exactly what I expected. Let's open it up for questions and see what the audience has to ask. You can raise your hand or you can start talking since no one's questioning.
Raman Menley with the California Department of Water Resources. Nice to see you, Patrick.
Hey, Roman.
Obviously, you use the current status in relation to Sigma implementation and climate change. My feeling, and maybe that's not the right way to look at it because we are all engineers, so we are more data centric. But I, under this future condition, we're going to be very detrimental to the San Joaquin Valley. We're thinking about like 3 million acre foot of water deficit per year by 2050, 2060, with the implementation of Sigma and climate change. Is there a risk? Yeah, obviously, like, collaboration is key for anything we are doing, as you've shown. But is there a risk to, just protect your assets at all costs at this point? And
I
and
mean,
how
yeah, go ahead.
and how would you, the social aspect of it, how would you include it in your modeling,
Yeah.
if you had the chance?
I mean, all really good. I'll start with the social side, just with full caveat that exploring partnerships is not the same as having the social connection and agreements and all of the time and effort. And again, the work that we showed here is not meant to be a critique of the actual Freant partnership as much as the exploration. So right now, we are not capturing that, the social elements of how do you actually get that. I think it's important in what we've shown is how stable is that coalition. Because I think a lot of times at the upfront when designing or thinking about those partnerships, it's hard to understand the fragility, especially when you start thinking about those worst off. And I think if I understood the way that you framed the beginning of the question is that these systems are going to be under a tremendous amount of strain, and there could be an impulse to avoid partnerships because that partnership exposes you to the choices, decisions, and risks of the other partners. Is that a fair synopsis of?
Correct.
Uh,
Yep.
yeah, for sure. It's the question is that the economy scale and that benefit in terms of do you, I guess there's a number of things there. There can be, in terms of building those partnerships, centralizing action and coordination, and in terms of distributing financial risk, if it's appropriate, that can all be wins for the partners. Some of that may be mandated, and some of that may be voluntary, depending on the context and the question. But I think it's not a panacea. And I think part of what we show here is that, a lot of structures can go poorly. And especially if you start to widen the uncertainties that they're exposed to and get into some of the more challenging social side of the problem. Getting and modeling that, I would say, I don't think there's any easy model-based panacea to get into some of the social complexities. I think one of the other things I tried to emphasize to a degree, but didn't go into a huge amount of detail, is the non-partnership folks, and if anybody feels like they're right, is receiving injury from the partnership. I mean, if you look more broadly in the West and in water markets and thinking about transfers and market mechanism, a lot of times they're not actually very active because of the transaction costs and that legal barriers and the regulatory barriers. And I think trying to represent that, and I think you all are doing a great job, right, in CalSim to getting in a lot more detail with CalSim 3 and some of that, but I think it's really hard to get into the social side. So a bit of a ramble. Hopefully I answered your question.
You did. Thank you.
So Patrick, there's a question in chat. Actually, Uh, the person wants to know how long it takes to run the model, computational aspects. And then there's another question that just popped up also.
Um, the running of the model depends on the context of the running. So how long are you running? So our function evaluations in terms of the stochastic, we got those down into measuring at, I don't remember off the top of my head exactly, but we were sort of in that 5 to 20 minute range, depending on what level of ensemble we were actually simulating. And then we were doing this on massively parallel computing systems.
Another question that's in there is how do you assess the opportunities for using agent-based modeling in the context of this big model, especially for including the social aspects of this complex system?
I think it's interesting. I think there are some challenges with agent-based modeling where you get what you specify. And so I think the rule systems, the state awareness, the amount of endogenous knowledge that you would have on that, there's a degree in the way that we are doing CalFuse that is actually, um, you could think of state awareness and action, and like you could think of the infrastructure and rules and the districts and the contractors as agents to a degree. And I had that earlier. Let's see if I can. Miraculously, I got there pretty fast. Okay. So there are elements to where we do have some degree of state aware, relatively simple agent-based decisions, but this is more on the water balance. It's not on the social elements or some of the more interesting theoretical aspects of that. I do think it would be interesting. I think the consequences on the computational side would be non-trivial because you'd have to think about how information flows across agents and across the state of the system and the different aspects of those states of the system. Um, so I think it would be interesting. I haven't seen agent-based modeling that has the level of dynamics and stochasticity that we've represented here, though.
Yeah.
And so I think that would be a challenge, but could be pretty exciting.
Two more questions. Wow, they're really clicking off. Okay, two more questions. How can we incorporate equity and social justice when designing such adaptive systems for water resources?
I mean, you don't quantify what you don't represent would be one. So thinking about the representation and the differences, I think one of the things that you see is we had 40 different districts and they have very, very different contexts, different partnerships, different dynamics, and different risk levels. So not accounting for their differences and their dynamics and the outcomes, you're just not going to be able to evaluate any differences in thinking about that. I think a more nuanced set of questions would have to come in terms of if you're asking specifically in terms of the preferences, the needs, and the specific contexts of the communities that are impacted. So at this level, um, we don't really have that representation in detail. I think what we have more is sort of the equality of performance across different districts. But if you dive in, those districts all have very different socioeconomic contexts, and I think you'd have to dive deeper into that. And I think there would need to be some more heavy lift co-production work in terms of the communities and the impacts.
Thanks. Next one is, have you considered accounting for market shocks triggering land use changes and/or political destabilization that would increase exposure risk for certain partners?
Sorry, I was just reading a comment. So
Yeah, I
could
know.
you repeat that?
Yeah, they're saying, have you considered accounting for market shocks triggering land use changes or political destabilization that would increase exposure risk for some partners?
I think, it's interesting in terms of have we considered it or thought about the market shocks or major changes in inflation or fundamentally different financial dynamics. I think I think those things are all interesting and potentially possible. I think our financial modeling in this is fairly simple. Some of the other work that my group and Greg Chiroklis's group has done, we've gotten more sophisticated in, for example, regional representations of financial risk in Tampa Bay, and actually Greg's group himself, Greg Chiroklis at UNC, has gotten into a lot more on the financial risk. But in short, I think there are scenarios where you can think about fundamental changes in the way that debt load and distribution of debt load and debt payment, as well as risk or supply could get in. So, um, yeah, we've done some things in terms of thinking about the shocks, but we haven't gone as far as I think you could. I think from the political destabilization or things like that, I think there's an interesting question about institutional stability and the stability of rule systems and the stability of your understanding of the rules of the road. Um, I think that's interesting. We have not gone deep into thinking about that, like fundamental right changes or institutional changes. We have done some basic exploratory modeling of major policy changes or major changes in terms of regulatory or other sort of uncertainties in different systems, not this system. So I do think the types of modeling that we're showing here could go down that exploratory approach. Um, so I would say early stages on that, interesting, but not super mature from what we've done so far.
Okay, thank you. So, Patrick, I had one question for you, which is very general, actually. I wonder if you have some distillation at a higher level of your results. Specifically, how does the scale of the partner, or their value of water influence the the participation in the partnership? Uh, because clearly, if the value of water was high, they're paying more. Really doesn't matter in a way, right?
Yeah, I think the scale and distribution and the background of individual partners has a huge influence. Also in terms of their ability to think about both the benefits of capital investment and the distributed risks on the financial side of that capital investment. Um, I think here, and not necessarily solely to this example, we've done other things in terms of like water supply municipalities of varying sizes, scales, partnering. I think I think in this, one of the things that we show is that you have smaller potential partners that may have far less financial stability and far less ability to actually utilize the investment. And those are often the worst off in the partnership itself. And they may not actually, if you think about it from an average or an aggregate summary cost benefit analysis, that would be washed out, right? You wouldn't necessarily see that. Um, so I think the disparity in terms of the degree of the scope and scale of the individual partners and those smaller partners or those partners that have more challenging socioeconomic contexts, um, those are the ones that they're probably not going to necessarily, innately benefit from partnering together or some kind of cooperative investment
No, I
without
think one
paying.
of the things you did actually allude to was this the as the size of the partnership grows, the transaction costs do go up substantially sometimes. So I was
Yes.
wondering whether, I mean, just at a very naive level, without getting into doing a lot of modeling, I would think that for each individual, their decision to become a partner or not would depend on their fixed cost of developing the supply themselves versus um, getting some benefit from others where the fixed cost is shared across the group. Does that come out as a factor?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, Some of the complexities of that is conceptually easy, but the question is, do the dynamics, and that could be the hydrology, the institutions, and the contracts and institutional connections actually bear that out. Some of the things that we've sort of explored here or see in this example is that even partnerships that are at the same size can have very different dynamics in terms of how the benefits accrue across partners and non-partners. And the other thing that I had mentioned here in terms of transaction costs is you have to be careful, particularly as shown here with the non-partners, where you create that project, that investment, and you don't want to negatively impact their rights. So I think it's those within the partnership have to have some sort of obvious marginal gain beyond what they could do individually. But also the collective partnership needs to have, a collective gain that isn't impacting in a very negative sense the folks that aren't participating.
Michael, you.
Yes, I enjoyed. I'm Michael Hanneman, and I've been working on water issues in this Central Valley for 40 years this summer. I found your work fascinating and very stimulating, and so very much want to. I saw only the CalFuse paper quite recently, so I'm looking forward to reading the others. A couple of comments. One, the first feature I thought of was something mentioned in the PPIC report. You talked about shared water rights as being a factor. I don't think it's quite there, but it's shared experience. And the obvious thing is, are you a CVP contractor or not? The CVP contractors have worked together for a long time. 20 years ago, I was in a lawsuit with an environmental group suing them. And so you have 4 districts. How likely is it that they would form a partnership? Well, I think one factor is, have they worked together? And in fact, are they already in a partnership? Are they CVP contractors or not? I think that's a very important factor in whether they reach an agreement or not. On the other hand, one feature both of irrigation districts, and I'm doing a lot of work with cities in Southern California, in Met Service area and San Diego County. There's a strong desire for local control. It's a little like school districts. If you compare Europe, England, or France, you have, schools, education is run on a broad regional level, but we have school districts in America, and each community wants to control its own water system. And but again, if there's a tradition of partnering with these other people, I think that's an important factor. 2 other comments. Water rights are a much bigger mess than I think you say in this area. I co-authored the paper with Philip Womble. He was my student on transaction costs. That's completely different in California. Water rights are not enforced, in effect, in California. There are transactions costs, but Colorado is a very different story. And the last related point I'll make is there is a history of shafting other people in the valley. You have the so-called white areas, which rely on groundwater, that don't have contracts with the CVP. And these white areas have expanded greatly in the last 70 years because the CVP deliveries since 1945 have raised the water table and have become the basis of the supply for quite a lot of acreage that was not farmed for 1945. And actually one major issue, the stigma and everything else, is do the white areas have rights, or should they go to hell because they are kind of hangers-on with no rights? So you could see wide areas with no rights banding together and maybe CVP contractors banding together in separate groups in terms of bargaining. But I thought this was a wonderful presentation and a wonderful body of work. And I'm so glad Manu set up this seminar. A lot to learn.
Yeah, thank you actually for the feedback, and yeah, a huge fan of your work. So, and yeah, totally acknowledge that the Colorado is a totally different context. And I think at the just total and transparently saying that our abstraction of partnerships here is in some sense cartoonishly simple and not accidentally so, because even in that abstraction, it's still you get extremely complex and potentially severe outcomes. And when you start to account for some of the nuances and the complexities that you've just highlighted, right, it doesn't get simpler.
I'll mention one thing. So it's a striking, it's a feature of California that in the water issues, since certainly since 1960, if not earlier, the state government, the governor and the legislature, most of the time stays out of the picture. That is, doesn't push around water districts. It writes reports, encouraging them to do things, but it doesn't nudge them or do anything stronger than nudging. So it's left, at the end of the day, they have to be willing to do that. And that's why there's been deadlock on the Delta since 1945 and continues. If there was a little kind of push from above and maybe money, and the state of course paid for the state water project, and has put up money, but it might need a nudge or a little push of some sort at state level or regional to bring about some of these alliances.
Yeah, I think the institutional incentives or disincentives are critical. I see Aurelie, is that the
Yeah,
proper?
Aurélie, close enough. Close enough. Well, first of all, thank you for a great presentation, great model. It's the first time I've been exposed to it, but I think it like touches base on a lot of the gaps I've seen in water partnerships, particularly. And quite a few people mentioned the social aspect, and being a social scientist myself, I'm kind of wondering with the growing focus on PFAS, both in research, funding, lawsuits, particularly in New Hampshire, Maryland, and also globally, do you see that as a potential avenue to kind of introduce health indicators as proxies for most social focused components in this type of modeling?
I think, one is obviously what we're doing is quite simplified. It's just water balance modeling, right? It's a complicated system, but it's not doing water quality, right? And then thinking about something, because if I heard you correctly, you said the interest in PFAS, right? And risk. I think it's interesting in how you would represent those systems. I think the transport problems are non-trivial in terms of how you actually capture the simulation and in terms of how PFAS would manifest into risk. I think that's several orders of magnitude more challenging in terms of getting into the like nuanced exposure dynamics and the way that it would go. I think I am not doing that work, so I don't want to ramble on like in total conjecture mode, but I would assume some degree of modeling and simulation and exploratory work is probably already afoot. To the degree that actually, I think where that gets really, really complicated is how you resolve the exposure element and the vulnerability element from the way that is impacting a community or individuals or things like that. So the resolution that you would need in the modeling seems like it would be you'd have to be very careful in what you select and what you represent and how well you could actually with fidelity simulate or model it.
Okay, there's one question left from Romain. Did you explore a larger footprint of potential collaboration than the Tulare region, including San Joaquin and LA?
No, so our modeling is we don't go all the way down to Southern California. You know, depending on how things evolve, there's potential extension projects with myself, Greg, and Alvar and others to extend. But no, we have not gone down to LA. I know there's some interesting work with the Artes model and representing the water supply and LA region itself, but that's very different than our model, and we haven't necessarily connected to it. So the short answer is we haven't expanded to that scope yet, or I say yet with optimism and aspiration.
Thanks, Patrick. Any other questions? Here's one. Oh, Romain is just saying thanks. Great. Yeah. Okay. Great work and great presentation. How do you envision your work informing policy?
You know, I think part of this is to maybe create at least some more nuanced understanding about the underlying importance of the dynamics, the connections between it's the extremes aren't one at a time. The connectivity between flood and drought and how those have to connect to integrated and well coordinated investment actions and overall planning pathways. That's what I would hope that we get at. I think also the importance. So not engaging with uncertainty is still modeling uncertainty. You're just being extremely optimistic. So I think being a little bit careful there, and I think acknowledging the degree of uncertainty and variability in these systems when you're setting policy. I think the other side of this is just, and in reading the paper, there's more discussion. Some of the regulatory and institutional complexities, and I think those are highlighted in some of the earlier comments and questions. Those are ultimately probably primary drivers. I mean, often we talk about hydrology, but I think those are the things, the institutional elements and the regulatory elements are going to be the big drivers of action or inaction.
Thanks again. I don't want to keep you longer because I know it's almost 9 o'clock your time. So very much appreciate it, Patrick. And I look forward to seeing you here. We will try to make sure that we invite you when it is not 100+ degrees, unless you want that temperature. But would totally love to see you here and get you involved in Colorado River things as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's time and attention, and thank you, Mano, for the invite.
Absolutely.